Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are super excited you're here. Before we get started, just going to go over a few quick things. First and foremost, I'd like to just let everyone know we've launched our fall annual fund drive. That is a significant part of our operating funding, and we've received a few donations already. We just want to point out that we have launched that. And that support that we receive for the fund drive and throughout the year is significant in allowing us to continue to operate and to provide programs such as the History Conversation. And as a friend of Montgomery history, many of you know that history matters, and it matters to you. We couldn't provide this content without you, and it's very important to us and to our community. And your support allows us to continue to share that that important, relevant local history with many members of our community and beyond. So if you'd like to donate, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the Donate Now. We are incredibly grateful for all of the support that everyone has provided this year. As our programs have exploded in popularity, we continue to see more and more interest throughout the community, and we couldn't continue to provide that without support. So again, just visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the banner there, and you can help us reach our goal of $25,000, which will allow us to continue to offer programs like this. Again, thanks for joining us. My name is Matt Gagel. I'm the Director of Programs here at Montgomery History. We are super excited about tonight's talk. Julianne Mangin will be providing us with a really cool story about some genealogical work she did to unravel a family mystery and how she went about that, and kind of give some ideas on how you can do that yourself. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function, and those questions will come to me. And then I will, if they're technical questions, I will try and answer those. If they're questions for Julianne, we will get to as many of those at the end of the program as we can. And then before we get started, just want to point out next week we'll be having a rewind, as it will be the Thanksgiving holiday. So we'll be talking about the Feast Your Ears presentation. This is a little bit of a throwback to a previous history conference. There'll be a presentation about a panel presentation about WHFS, I believe. I can't remember the exact, yeah, WHFS, I apologize. And their experience, their influence on the county. And then the week after that, we'll be joined by the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And they'll be talking about how a museum can influence the community around it in the 21st century, and how it can move beyond just a stuffy old box and here's an item. While those things are cool, part of the mission of a history organization is to explain the relevance and to connect to the community and explain why history matters, which is, you know, something that we are very passionate about, and many of you are passionate about as well. So we're excited for that. That'll be next Tuesday, December 1st at 2 p.m. So back to our normal regular schedule in Tuesday afternoons. Okay, I'm done talking. With that, I will introduce Julianne Mangin, who is a member of the Montgomery History Speakers Bureau, and she is a former Library of Congress. Julianne, you're gonna have to remind me, I can't remember if it was a researcher. Oh, you were a webmaster, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes, you're a webmaster, okay. But she's also a passionate researcher and has done a lot of work with local research and with genealogical research. Okay, Julianne, you can go ahead and start your share whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to turn off my video so you can see my presentation in full screen. I think that'll work best. So let's see.
And again, anyone, if you have any questions at the presentation, please use the Q&A function, and we'll address those at the end. All right, looks like we are just about ready.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd like to add about, oops, let's keep going. Oops, now I'm too far ahead. There. Ha.
There we go.
Anyway, the one thing that I would like to mention is at the end when we do Q&A, I'd like to still have the last frame of my presentation on the screen, but you can put my face on because I'll have a list of the links that I talked about during the presentation will be on that last screen. So don't feel like you have to worry
Okay.
about the slide going by during the presentation. Anyway.
Yep. And again, at the end, also, if there's anything you miss, we can certainly connect you with Julianne, and she can help you kind of find what you're looking for. So I'm going to stop talking now. Julianne, take it away.
I will. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is how I use genealogy to bust a few myths that I'd been told about my family. And my sources included the usual suspects, vital records such as birth, death, and marriage certificates, and census data. But I was also able to access the patient records for 4 of my ancestors who had been committed to state hospitals for the mentally ill. I also used maps and newspapers to stitch together a family narrative. I uncovered family secrets that helped me to understand how traumatic events in the distant past had affected my family down through the generations. As a result, I've come to see genealogy and family history as a way to empower myself and to heal old wounds. So here's a little background on my family. My mother grew up in Connecticut, first in Stonington, then Danielson, and later Norwich. She moved to Washington, D.C. when she was in her 20s, just after World War II ended. At about the same time, my father moved there from Indiana, and my parents met at Catholic University of America, and then they married in 1948. And the photo on the left is them at Union Station leaving for their honeymoon, and of course the Capitol is in the background. So in 1951, they moved to Wheaton, Maryland, and they raised 6 children, and I'm the third. Now, once upon a time, I was a reluctant genealogist. My mother had dabbled in genealogy for decades, starting about the time that I entered high school. But I wasn't interested in genealogy because to me it seemed like the gathering of dry facts about who begat whom and where they married and when they died. But I was more curious about Mom's stories about her family and in the way that she told them to me, which was in these short and disconnected anecdotes. The one that she repeated most often was this. My mother had an uncle who set her up in business running a delicatessen in Stonington. During the Great Depression, the business failed. When I was 7 years old, my mother became mentally ill and was sent to a mental hospital. I was taken from my father and put into the county home. Mom usually changed the subject after blurting out this family tragedy as if she were releasing some emotional buildup like a pressure cooker. She didn't like it if I suggested that her father had abandoned her. She always insisted that he'd been a good father, even though he divorced Grandma while she was in the mental hospital, and he never tried to get Mom out of the county home. It made no sense to me. And here's another story that my mom used to tell. When my mother was a child, she lived in a shed. Her youngest sister was born there. Their father deserted them and went back to Canada, causing their mother to go insane.
Julianne, I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt. Could you maybe move the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth? I've had a few people say they're struggling to hear you a little bit.
Oh, okay. I thought I had it as close as it can be. Is this better?
It's a little bit louder. Yep, that should help.
And I can always push harder.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks for the feedback. I hope you at least heard enough. So anyway, when I asked Mom why her mother was living in a shed, she simply replied, that's what I was told. Mom didn't know where the shed was, and she didn't know why her mother's family was living in it. The thing that bothered me about genealogy was that no matter how much research Mom did, nothing changed about the stories she told over the years. What I wanted was a more continuous and coherent narrative of the family history, and it didn't seem like genealogy was going to do that for me. At first, I suspected that Mom's story about Grandma living in a shed as a child was another one of those crazy things that Grandma had told her a long time ago and which Mom simply took at face value. I imagine that my grandmother, who suffered at times from hallucinations and delusions, had exaggerated her living conditions. Perhaps it was a small, rickety house, I thought, but surely not a shed. At the time, I hadn't realized how poor Grandma's family had been. So in 2012, at the age of 87, my mother was moved into assisted living. My dad had passed away in 2004. The unit was too small to accommodate her genealogy research, which was stored in boxes full of binders and file folders and pedigree charts and census sheets and certificates and photographs. And all of that came to my house, where I stored it in my basement, intending to hang on to it until someone else in the family expressed interest in genealogy. But the librarian in me couldn't resist peeking into the boxes and organizing what was there. I didn't know at the time that I was on a slippery slope from being a reluctant genealogist to a relentless family historian. So as I poked around in the boxes, I was surprised to discover what wasn't there. There was nothing about Grandma's time at the mental hospital except for a couple of letters addressed to her at Norwich State Hospital in Connecticut. Until that time, I hadn't been sure where the so-called mental hospital had been. Now I had a name. And after a brief internet search, I located the hospital records at the state archives at the Connecticut State Library, and I requested her patient record. After proving that I was descended from a patient of Norwich State Hospital, I received not only Grandma's record, but the records of 3 other family members who had been patients there. My great-grandmother Graziella, who was there from 1908 to 1910, her sister Rose from 1924 to 1925, my grandmother Beatrice, who was a patient from 1935 to 1944, and her sister Pauline, who was there from 1929 to 1930. And in addition, Beatrice had another sister, Denora, who was a patient at a state hospital in New York from 1940 until her death in 1954. So to sum it up, not only was Grandma Beatrice mentally ill, but so was her mother, one of her aunts, and both of her sisters. So it was quite a shock to discover the amount of mental illness on my maternal grandmother's side of the family. Nevertheless, the patient records I received were a wealth of information about 2 generations of my mother's family. When patients were admitted, they were evaluated both psychologically and physically. The patient's relatives were also interviewed, and the results were used to put together a social history of the family. Well, this, of course, is a family historian's dream come true. These records help me answer not only the question of why Grandma lived in a shed, but where it might be. And they also help me find the real story behind the delicatessen, the mental hospital, and the county home. So first, I'd like to talk to you about the story behind the shed. So Grandma's parents, Philippe Medi and Graciela Bonneau, were born in Quebec, Canada, but grew up in Danielson, Connecticut. They married there in 1899 when they were both in their early 20s. During the 1900 U.S. Census, they lived on Furnace Street. Both of them worked in a textile mill, probably the Quinnebog Milk Company. If they were typical mill employees, they would have worked 12 or 13-hour days, 6 days a week. In addition to the long hours, mill workers had to tolerate low pay and unsafe conditions. Spinners such as Philippe were expected to change bobbins while the machines were still in operation, often doing this by climbing into the machines in their bare feet. Ventilation in the mills was usually poor. Cotton lint swirled through the air, which was kept at a high humidity so that the threads wouldn't break. So lung ailments were common. So in 1901, Graziella gave birth to her first child, my grandmother Beatrice. Graziella probably quit work at that point and stayed home with the baby. Philippe became the sole support of the family. More children came in 1903 and 1904, and they also had a son in 1905, but he only lived for 2 months. And about that time, Graziella began to show signs of mental illness, probably due to the stress of poverty and all of the pregnancies. Philippe couldn't leave her alone with the children, but he still needed to work. So leaving his family in the care of a trusted relative was the obvious solution. The question was, why would he have moved his family to a shed? Now, I was told that Grandma's youngest sister was born in the shed, so he must have made the move around 1907, the year that she was born. I wondered, where could the shed have been, even if it existed? The first clue was something I found in the correspondence file attached to Graziella's patient record. Her older sister Alexandrine had written to the hospital superintendent in 1908. She asked about Graziella's condition and mentioned that their mother was taking care of all four of her children. She also wrote that, quote, if my sister does not get well soon, we shall soon have to find some way to place those children. So it seemed to me that if there was indeed a shed, it would have been on property owned by Graziella's parents, Pierre and Isilda Bonneau. I wondered if I could prove whether the Bonneaus had a shed in their backyard. And if they did, how likely was it that they would have allowed their daughter's family to live in it? Another question was, well, who was already living in the Bonneau house in 1907? Looking at the family tree, I learned at the time that Graziella's parents still had 6 children of their own at home. 2 daughters who were in their 20s, a son and 2 daughters who were in their teens, and then a son who was 11. In addition, Pierre's elderly mother was also living with them. In all, there were 5 adults, 3 teens, and a child. This seemed like a lot of people to be living under one roof, so I wondered what size and shape of house Pierre and Zilda had owned. Using land records in the U.S. Census, I determined that the Bonneau family lived at 32 Cottage Street in Danielson, Connecticut from 1897 to 1925. So I looked for that address on Google Maps, and I found that it was a large house sitting right next to the railroad tracks. In the satellite image, it looked more like a small apartment building than a single-family home. With a house that big, I couldn't imagine that they would have expected Philippe, Graziella, and their children to live in a shed. But when I searched that address on a real estate website, the record showed that the building had been erected in 1910, which didn't fit with what I found in the land and census records. So curious about this discrepancy, I went looking for maps from around 1907 when Philippe and his family might have lived in a shed. Here's the kind of map I used to resolve these questions. The Sanborn Map Company created fire insurance maps to document business and residential structures in populated areas to assess their risk for damage or destruction by fire. They included information on each building, such as how many stories there were, what material was used, what type of roof covered it, and whether there were any sprinklers installed. Although these maps were created for use by fire insurance companies and underwriters, over the years they've become a valuable resource for historians, preservationists, and genealogists. So most state libraries and local historical societies have Sanborn maps that cover their areas. And that's fine if you happen to live in the area where you're researching. But if not, you can look for them online. The Library of Congress has the largest existing set of Sanborn maps, which number in the hundreds of thousands and go back to the 19th century. These maps cover 12,000 cities and towns in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Many have been digitized and are available through their website. So the online Sanborn maps at the Library of Congress can be searched in 2 different ways. This is the digital map collection at the Library of Congress, and I've drilled down to the Sanborn maps. This is where the digital images are stored, and there's a search box on this page, but I find that it doesn't always help me find exactly what I want to know. So I recommend that you approach the Sanborn maps through this other web page. And this is it from the Geography and Map Reading Room web page. This search form allows you to drill down to the maps by state and town. And then when you select a town, it will show you all the maps that exist. And if any of them are digitized, it will provide a link to the map which is online, which will take you over to that other site. So not all of the maps have been digitized due to copyright restrictions. However, it's estimated that at least 70% of them are available online. Back when I was doing my research, though, the Sanborn maps were not yet online. But fortunately, I lived just outside Washington, D.C., and I visited the Library of Congress and used the actual Sanborn maps. I found maps for Danielson, Connecticut that were made in 1903 and also in 1911. Both of these maps showed 32 Cottage Street as being 2 blocks away from the railroad tracks, not next to them, as I'd seen in the Google Maps. I realized that the houses in the town of Danielson had been renumbered sometime after the 1920 census. I went back to Google Maps so that I could compare the satellite image of Cottage Street with the one on the Sanborn map. What had once been 32 Cottage Street is now 65 Cottage Street. Further visual comparison of the 2 images, dated over a century apart, showed that the footprints of the structures on the property were almost the same, including the shed in the backyard. So here's an overlay that I hope shows it a little better. Once I made this discovery, I returned to the real estate website and found a listing for 65 Cottage Street. It had been built in 1884, which fit with my family history timeline. And not only was the Bonneau's house still standing, it was on the market. On my next trip to Danielson, I contacted a real estate agent who had listed it. And she agreed to show me the house, even though I made it clear I had no interest in buying it. But being a president of a nearby historical society, the agent understood my need to see the ancestral home, such as it is. The house on Cottage Street was a little wood frame house covered in shingles that stood 1.5 stories high. It had 5 bedrooms, but only 1 bath. All the rooms were tiny. I tried to imagine the house in 1907 when Pierre, Isilda, 6 of their children, and Pierre's mother lived there. Walking through the rooms, I realized how crowded it must have been even before Philippe came looking for a place for his family to live. It was indeed likely that Grandma had lived in a shed when she was a little girl. I mean, where else could they have put her family? After touring the house, I asked the real estate agent if she could unlock the door to the shed and let me look around inside. It appeared to be about 10 by 20 feet in area and not a lot of space for 2 adults and 4 children. While I was inside the shed pondering this grim reality, the real estate agent poked her head into the shed. She pointed to the roof sheathing and the floorboards and said, "Wow, this wood's from the 19th century." That's when I realized that I was standing on the same floorboards as had my ancestors Graziella, Philippe, and Beatrice. Visiting the shed on Cottage Street went beyond mere genealogical research for me. It allowed me to acknowledge and honor my grandmother's childhood suffering. In June of 1908, Graziella had a miscarriage. Around the same time, there was a fire in the house. I'm not sure which one happened first, but having these 2 things happen so closely together caused Graziella to lose control of her mind. She became incoherent, claiming that she was a skeleton or a statue of salt. She wanted to kill herself, and she wanted to kill Philippe too, apparently. So it was that point that he had her committed to Norwich State Hospital. Her commitment papers contain a sworn statement that Philippe had taken her to the hospital himself. And this is the first evidence that I found that Philippe had not left Graziella prior to her becoming mentally ill. My mother's story that he had gone back to Canada causing his wife to become insane was starting to unravel. I was haunted by the statement in Alexandrin's letter that, quote, "If my sister does not get well soon, we shall have to find some way to place those children." The superintendent wrote back to her that Graziella had taken a turn for the worse and that it would not be wise for her to leave the hospital for some time yet. If Graziella was considering placing her children in someone else's care in 1908, perhaps the 1910 census could tell me where they ended up. I went back to Mom's genealogical research only to find that she had never located her in the 1910 census, which would have been the first one where Grandma's name would have appeared. It seemed like an odd omission. I sometimes wondered if Mom thought the point of genealogy was simply to confirm those facts she already knew or wanted to believe about her family. During the 1910 census, Graziella was listed among the patients of Norwich State Hospital. Philippe was living on Franklin Street with his parents. Pierre and Isilda Bonneau were still living on Cottage Street. However, only one of the four Medi children was living with them at the time, 3-year-old Pauline. So where were my grandmother Beatrice and her siblings Leonard and Denora? I searched the 1910 census records and found a 9-year-old girl named Beatrice Medi living in Manchester, New Hampshire. At first, I didn't think this could be Grandma. As far as I know, all of Mom's ancestors were from Connecticut, Rhode Island, or Quebec. However, I noticed that this Beatrice Medi had been born in Connecticut in 1901, just like Grandma had been. The head of the household in which she lived was a man named Hercule d'Avignon. Everyone else in the household was listed and described according to their relationship to him: wife, son, daughter. Beatrice was listed at the end and was called an ad child. Remembering that Isilda's maiden name had also been d'Avignon, I wondered if she had a brother or some other male relative named Hercule. If so, maybe that was my grandmother living in New Hampshire in 1910. I realized that researching my great great grandmother Isilda's family more thoroughly might help, especially if I could establish that she was related to Hercule d'Avignon of Manchester. When I first started researching my family history, I had focused on my direct ancestors, not their siblings. Now that I wanted to clarify the relationship between Beatrice Medi and Hercule d'Avignon, I could see how looking for collateral relatives, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins, could be a way to solve a family history dilemma by coming at it from a different angle. I knew that Isilda had been born in Quebec in 1855 to Narcisse and Martine d'Avignon. I searched the Quebec church records for baptismal records for their children. It turned out that Isilda had been one of 12, one of whom was a younger brother named Hercule, born in 1865. This would have made him about 45 in 1910, just like the Hercule d'Avignon in Manchester. Feeling more confident that it was my grandmother I found in New Hampshire, I returned to the 1910 census to search for Beatrice's other two siblings. To my surprise, I found that 7-year-old Leonard was also listed in Manchester, New Hampshire, living in St. Peter's Orphanage. He was one of 141 residents of the orphanage, all boys, ranging in age from 2 to 14 years. After further searching, I found Beatrice's 6-year-old sister Denora listed in the orphans ward of Notre Dame of Lourdes Hospital, also in Manchester. She was among 119 girls ranging in age from 3 to 14 who were cared for by the Sisters of Charity. The presence of Beatrice's siblings in the same city where I found her had to be more than just a coincidence. The Medi children, except for the youngest, Pauline, had been sent away to New Hampshire while their mother was in the asylum. Sadly, they were separated from each other when they got there. I can't imagine how traumatic this must have been for them. I was writing and researching about this part of my family story when I first learned about migrant children being separated from their families by U.S. immigration officials. It made me feel as heartbroken for those children as I was for my own ancestors. It made me think if more people knew their own family histories, maybe they'd have empathy for what others are going through in the present. As I mentioned earlier, One of the secrets that came out of Graziella's patient record was that Philippe hadn't left her and returned to Canada, causing her to go insane, as my mother had always told me. He was with her when she became mentally ill and made the difficult decision to commit her to Norwich State Hospital. He saw her regularly, according to the visitor log in her file. There are letters in her correspondence file in which he asked the superintendent about her condition and when she could come home. Philippe last saw his wife the day before she died in December 1910 when he brought a Catholic priest to her to administer last rites. I wondered why the story had come down to Mom that he had vanished much earlier. It may have been because some of the other things he had been doing around the same time. Philippe had not been faithful to Graziella when she was in the hospital. I found an article in the Norwich Bulletin from 1910 in which he was accused of stealing a necklace. His accomplice was a woman with whom he was living in Norwich. This happened in April while his mentally ill wife was still alive. I'm sure that Isilda and Pierre, Graziella's parents, were scandalized and embarrassed by the newspaper report of their son-in-law's behavior. After Graziella died, Philippe left his 4 children, who had all returned from New Hampshire, in the care of his in-laws, the Bonneaus. By that time, he may have been unwelcome at the Bonneau house. I wondered where Philippe might have gone after leaving Danielson. Still assuming it was somewhere in Canada, like Mom told me, I tried to locate Philippe Medi in the Quebec church records. I thought perhaps he had remarried after he became a widower. But I couldn't find a marriage record for him anywhere. It seemed as if my search for my prodigal great-grandfather was at a dead end. One day, while searching for relatives with the surname Meddy in the 1920 census, I came across a Philip Meddy who lived in Maynard, Massachusetts, with his wife Marie E. and son Charles D. Philip Meddy had the same place of birth as my great-grandfather, 1877 in Canada, and a similar occupation, working in a textile mill, as well. This find was so unexpected that I initially doubted that it could be my Philippe, but I decided to give the record a closer look anyway. Philippe was listed as single, but Marie was listed as his wife. Their son Charles was the same age as one of Philippe's children. So what could that mean? Did Philippe have a secret second family, or were these 2 different men? It was only by looking back at the 1910 census that I figured it all out. I already knew where Philippe was in 1910. He was in Danielson. So I decided that if I searched the 1910 census and found Philip Meddy in Massachusetts with the same family members, then Philip and Philippe were probably 2 different men. When I couldn't find Philip, Marie, and Charles living together as a family in 1910, I had to change my search strategy. My new theory was that the Philip in Massachusetts was my great-grandfather. He had married Marie and adopted Charles, and that's why they all had the same last name. I searched the 1910 census just for Marie and Charles without a surname, assuming that she'd been married to someone else at the time. Because I knew without a surname I'd get thousands of hits, I limited my search of the census records geographically to Danielson, Connecticut. If that didn't work, I'd have to broaden my search to the county of Windham, then neighboring counties, and perhaps the entire state. But fortunately, I got a relevant hit on the first try. The top result was for a family in Danielson headed by George E. Meddy with a wife Mary E. and a son Charles D. Looking back at my genealogy database, I confirmed that Philippe's brother George had a wife named Marie Eva and a son named Charles David. George's wife and child were the same ages as the Marie E. and Charles D. who were listed in the 1920 census with Philip. This could mean only one thing. I had stumbled on another family secret. My great-grandfather, Philippe Meddy, had not returned to Canada, as I'd always been told. He'd run off to Massachusetts with his brother's wife and child. The myth that he'd left earlier and returned to Canada was probably a cover story told to my grandmother as a child to shield her from the embarrassment to the family. But wait, there's more. I became curious about George Meddy, Philippe's brother. I searched for stories in newspapers about him, too. What I found shocked me. George was a violent man and a pervert. In one report, he broke the jaw of a man with whom he'd been playing cards. In another, he exposed himself to a couple of women who passed his house on their way to church. In the latter case, George was sentenced to 3 months in jail. Marie probably felt unsafe around her husband, and it's likely that while George was incarcerated, Marie decided to ask her brother-in-law for help. Philippe's solution was to run away with Marie and Charles to Massachusetts. Since they all had the same surname, Meddy, they could easily pose as a legitimate family. Beatrice's grandparents, who were taking care of her, died not long after her mother did. Pierre died in 1911, and Azilda died on Thanksgiving Day in 1912. With Philippe nowhere to be found, Beatrice and her siblings were raised by Graziella's sisters, Rose and Elodia, in the house on Cottage Street. My grandmother dealt with a lot of family upheaval between the ages of 6 and 12. Her life as a young woman was not much better. This is where Mom's story of the delicatessen, the mental hospital, and the county home fits in. I pieced together this part of the story mostly from Grandma's patient record at Norwich State Hospital. Grandma Beatrice and Grandpa Frank met when he delivered coal to her home at 32 Cottage Street. In many ways, my grandparents were complete opposites. Beatrice was petite, dark-haired, French-Canadian, and Catholic. Frank was tall, fair-haired, Anglo-American, and Protestant. Religious reasons alone could have accounted for the disapproval of both of their families for their courtship. In addition, Beatrice's aunts didn't want her to get married and leave home. They believed that Beatrice owed it to them to stay and continue to earn money to support the family. Frank's family may have objected to the marriage also because they were disturbed by Beatrice's difficult personality. Despite the family disapproval, Beatrice and Frank married in 1922. She was 21 and he was 26. The marriage seemed doomed from the start. 2 months after the wedding, Beatrice left Frank and went to live with her Aunt Blanche and her husband Napoleon. When Beatrice became pregnant in 1924, though, she and Frank were reunited. The family lore was that the two had continued to see each other even though they were separated. Uncle Napoleon set Beatrice up to run a delicatessen in Stonington. Mom was born in 1925 and was named after Grandma's sister Pauline. She spent her early years living at the delicatessen. Beatrice began to display psychotic behavior in 1928. At times, she seemed to be in a trance, but she'd also laugh and cry inappropriately. She accused Frank of having sex with his stepmother, and she assaulted them both. During this time, my mother was between the ages of 3 and 6 years old. How confusing must this have been for her? In 1931, the delicatessen failed. Mom always said that it failed due to the Great Depression, but Beatrice's patient record from the Norwich State Hospital told a different story. Beatrice told the hospital staff that while she was living with her aunt's family, her uncle by marriage forced her into a sexual relationship. She told the hospital staff that, quote, he said it was nothing as we were relations and I felt it was the only way out, end quote. The timing of this relationship raised my suspicions about whether Uncle Napoleon was my mother's father rather than Frank. I believe that's why Beatrice was set up in the delicatessen when she got pregnant. She was reunited with her husband in order to deflect suspicion that anyone else might be Mom's father. Beatrice kept quiet about the relationship, but it seems that her psychotic symptoms could very well have been triggered by the trauma of unwanted sex and the stress of trying to keep this a secret from her husband Frank. In 1931, Beatrice told Uncle Napoleon that she wouldn't have sex with him anymore, and that's when he closed down the delicatessen and threw Grandma and her family out. After they left the deli, Beatrice and Frank and little Pauline returned to Danielson. Beatrice continued to accuse Frank of cheating on her. Her delusions about his infidelity were perhaps symptoms of her paranoid schizophrenia. Frank, for his part, was a disabled World War I veteran who suffered not only from the effects of mustard gas, but also from shell shock, which is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. He didn't know how to handle her rantings or his own violent impulses, which is why their marriage devolved into physical abuse. In 1933, Beatrice told Frank about the relationship she'd had with her uncle, and so the violence only got worse from there. When I learned this, I realized that my mom, only 8 years old at the time, had been a witness to much of it. Beatrice and Frank were separated again in 1935 after they had a huge fight. The police were called and the state social services became involved. Beatrice was committed to Norwich State Hospital, and Mom was sent to the county home. This is the new London County temporary home for neglected or uncared for children. That's how they put it in the legislation. Um, I once called it an orphanage in my mother's presence, and she bristled at my statement. We were not orphans, she said. We all knew where our parents were, as if that made it better. Grandpa visited Mom at the county home a few times a year, but around 1938, when she was 13, his visits stopped. For years, neither Grandma nor Mom knew where he was. Mom had grown up in a household full of violence and secrets. As tragic as this story is, I was glad to learn the truth. Finally, the stories Mom told made sense. Of course, she had to insist that Grandpa had been a wonderful father and that it wasn't his fault that the state wouldn't let him raise her. To think otherwise would have meant acknowledging the pain of being abandoned by him. If she suspected that the uncle had been her father, which I think she may have, she was dealing with a second fatherly abandonment and a great deal of shame as well. This might explain why she had been so rigid about the details of her story. During World War II, staffing shortages caused the superintendent of Norwich State Hospital to hire patients to act as attendants. Beatrice was considered a high-functioning schizophrenic, so she was among the first patients chosen to do this work. She performed so well that in 1943 she was given a parole to her own custody while still living at the hospital. This meant that she could move out of the patient ward and into employee housing. In 1944, around the time that she was to be discharged from the hospital, Frank filed for and was granted a divorce. With nowhere else to go, Beatrice remained at the hospital as an employee for the next 14 years. By researching my grandmother's story and also the history of state hospitals during her lifetime, I gained an appreciation of the struggles and hardships she endured during her many years as a patient. It made it all the more remarkable that she was able to regain her independence and support herself despite a serious mental illness. In the meantime, Mom remained a ward of the state. Because she did well academically, she received scholarships and grants and was able to attend the University of Connecticut. During that time, she aged out of the child welfare system. In 1947, she moved to Washington, D.C. to study library science at Catholic University of America. So there's an interesting fact about this photo. A few years before it was taken, the U.S. Department of Education had a grant program to encourage school librarians to get science degrees. However, it wasn't until this class of the library science school that grants were extended to librarians in parochial schools, which explains the presence of so many nuns and so many different kinds of nuns. In 1958, Beatrice retired with a state pension, and then something really amazing happened. Beatrice and Frank got back together and remarried. As a child, I knew my grandparents because they would visit our home in Wheaton, Maryland about once a year. I didn't have much of a relationship with Grandma. Her mental illness made her difficult to be around. Every visit to our home featured at least one incident in which she would blow up in anger at my mother. Once it was because Mom had run out of instant coffee. At other times, she might be catatonic and barely notice anyone in the room. So as a result, I tended to keep out of her way. This is a 1958 snapshot of my grandparents and me. I have a smile on my face, oblivious to the nonverbal drama going on behind me. Grandma was notorious for being jealous. Every time I look at this photograph, I wonder if she was jealous, even of me. Grandma and Grandpa remained together, living in Connecticut for 8 years until she died in 1966. Grandpa then moved in with Mom, Dad, and the 6 of us kids in Wheaton. Mom was thrilled. Not only was she reunited with the father she idolized, but with Grandma no longer in the picture, she had his attention all for herself. Unfortunately, he died 4 months after Grandma did, which devastated Mom. It was following his death that she began to research her genealogy, perhaps as a way of coping with her grief. As I mentioned before, Mom's stories about her family were brief and disconnected. She had researched her family tree for decades, but nothing she learned through genealogy changed her stories one bit. Mom never wavered in her opinions about what her family stories meant, and she could get testy if I pointed out a discrepancy. For that reason, I went through most of my life thinking that the family history belonged to her alone and not to me. It was part of the reason I was reluctant to take up genealogy. When I finally began to explore the past on my own, I realized that she may have held on to those skewed family tales as a way to cope with the family trauma. The more I invested time and energy in doing genealogical research, the more I came to believe that her family history was my family history too. It was an empowering feeling. I had a right to know what really happened, and I had a right to decide for myself what it meant. One of the first things a beginning genealogist is told to do is to talk to their living relatives and ask them what they know. Particular attention should be given to the oldest relatives. Mom was cut off from most of her relatives for reasons that are now obvious. I made it my mission to locate, if possible, living relatives from Grandma Beatrice's family. Among her first cousins, there was only one whose death I could not confirm. Graziella had a sister, Corinne, who was 15 years younger than her, and Corinne had a daughter named Rita, who was born the year after Mom was. The genealogical trail went cold after the 1940 census when Rita was 13 years old. It was likely that she'd married, but I didn't know her married name. In February 2013, I was in Stonington doing family research. I stopped at the cemetery where Corinne and her husband were buried. I found their gravestones in a row of 4. After taking photographs of their 2 stones, I became curious about the other 2 in the row. To the far left was a stone for Matthew Hoadley, who died in 1999. But between his stone and the ones for Corinne and her husband, there was one for Rita Hoadley. Not only did it show the same birth year as Corinne's daughter, but there was no death year at all. So I called directory assistance right from the cemetery, and soon I was at the home of my first cousin, twice removed. Rita was 86 years old and sharp as a tack and had many photos and stories to tell. She was Grandma's first cousin and my mother's childhood playmate. She knew many of the people whose names, to me, had only been entries in a database up to that point. She even knew about the relationship between Grandma and Uncle Napoleon. If I hadn't met Rita, I would have never known what my great-great-grandmother Isilda looked like, or my great aunts and uncle, or seen photos of Mom and Rita together. I might never have known what Uncle Napoleon looked like. Even after my research was done, I would visit Rita a couple times a year because she was just a joy to be around. She passed away in January 2020 at the age of 93. I had 7 lovely years in which to get to know her and her family. In July 2013, I spit into a plastic vial and I sent it off to Ancestry.com for DNA testing. I wasn't one of those people who wanted to know their ethnicity, and I wasn't an adoptee searching for my birth family. I just wanted to know who Mom's father was, Grandpa or Uncle Napoleon. It took several months, but in April 2014, I finally got a DNA match that answered the question. Ancestry estimated that this match and I were first or second cousins. When I looked at her family tree, I saw that her great-grandparents were the parents of Uncle Napoleon. The only way we could be second cousins were if these were my great-grandparents too, making Uncle Napoleon my grandfather. My mother, who passed away in 2017, was remarkable in many ways. She endured a dysfunctional family and was separated from her parents at the age of 10, yet she still managed to thrive. It was no wonder that Mom always emphasized the importance of education. It had been her ticket out of poverty and dependence on the state. She also instilled in me a love of books, gardening, nature, and music. However, she was not a warm or emotionally supportive mother, which was hard for me when I was growing up. But when I look at her family history, I ask myself, what were her parental role models? A schizophrenic mother, an absent father, and a county home. Grandma also had a mentally ill mother, a missing father, and had been sent away from the family home. I'm grateful that Mom managed not to repeat this pattern for my generation. She was the best mother she could have been under the circumstances. But it's also sad that there was often tension between Mom and I, tension that might have been alleviated if she'd been able to talk about the family trauma. Before I take questions, I'd like to mention that I was a featured guest on 2 episodes of the Genealogy Gems podcast. This podcast is an excellent source of genealogical research tips. Episode 219 is devoted to this part of my family's story. And number 231 features a shorter interview with me about another family story and also a little bit about the Aspen Hill Pet Cemetery, which is another one of my research interests. So with that, I'm ready for questions. And
Okay.
can I start my own video?
You should be able to. Yeah, there
And
it
there
is.
I
Okay.
am.
Okay. All right. So again, if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A button. We'll give it a second here. Julianne, thanks so much. It's incredible to hear the story of how you used, well, somewhat modern research tools to find the this and solve this family mystery that you know, kind of you had your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any questions. Again, if anyone has any questions, please. Here we go. We got a couple rolling in here.
Excellent.
So someone says, now that you know your direct line goes back to Uncle Napoleon, have you changed your family tree? How do you acknowledge your grandfather Frank, or your grandfather Frank and grandfather Napoleon?
Well, I've officially changed my lineage to reflect the biological reality. So it shows that I'm descended from his branch of the family. It's kind of interesting because he was also French Canadian, and uh, if you know anything about the French Canadians, they settled in Canada like in the 17th century, and they didn't move around a lot, and they were a very insular society. So, in fact, even if he hadn't been my biological grandfather, he still would have been a very distant relative. But anyway, it was a surprise to me because I'd always thought that I was only 1/4 French Canadian, following through my maternal grandmother's line, but I'm actually half French Canadian through my mother, and my mother was obviously 100% French Canadian. So it was an interesting thing to find out.
Okay. This is interesting. It says, "Hi, Julie. This is Donna Murphy from high school. I am I am thoroughly loving your story. I have done some genealogical research myself because my mother was adopted, not once but twice. Most of my life, I believed my mother knew nothing about her birth family. But she did know some things, and I even remember some hints or clues in her comments that have jibed with things I have learned via ancestry and other means. She was illegitimate from her father. The question cuts off, but I think it's more just a comment about
Oh,
how she's done that. So,
oh yeah, and I'd like to comment that, hi Donna, gosh, I haven't seen you in decades, but it's so nice of you to remember me. And well, I just want to say I really can sympathize with your journey you're taking, trying to find, some resolution and understanding where your family really came from. And two adoptions, that makes it kind of complicated. I've also, I wish sometimes I had time to talk about this, but there's a whole dynamic of what family secrets, um, the effect it has on subsequent generations if they're not, if there's something hidden, especially if it's something traumatic hidden. People think, oh, well, I won't tell the kids and it won't harm them. But the psychological effects do pass down. And so I think it's these kind of, this kind of search is an important thing for a lot of people for their healing, which is why I did it. And not just to heal myself, but also other of my family members, and also anyone else out there who hears my story and feels inspired or feels like, oh, now I get it. I'm not crazy to want to know this stuff. So I'm just sort of throwing that out as a support to you, Donna, and to anybody else who's listening, that this is why this is important. I hope it came through in my talk.
okay. Donna has a little bit. She goes on a little further. I guess she must have hit enter or something. But she said father's family was very prominent in Rockville and Maryland history all the way back to the 1600s. I'd love to
Oh,
talk to you more about your methods and reconnect after so many years. Uh,
oh, sure.
so I
Well,
guess you go ahead. Yep.
well, this is for anybody out there too. My website is juliannemangin.com, and there's a contact form, so you can send me an email. And also, I hope you all get to look at all of these links that I put on the page also. And because those are the main resources, although I did other things, these are the resources that really helped me get going.
Okay. Someone asks, well, a couple people have kind of asked, do you have any tips on finding relatives who are who were or are residents in institutions? I find it difficult. Census, other ways.
Well, the thing is that if most of these hospitals were state institutions, and so their records would normally go to whatever the state archive is. And so in my case, I went to the state of Connecticut archive. And then when you locate the records, whether you're going to be allowed to see it is a state by state question. And Connecticut seems to take a broader interpretation of who should get access. And I provided birth certificates and death certificates that showed that I was related to somebody who was a patient there. And then they sent me copies. But I had two other relatives. One went to a state hospital, Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. And so I tried to get her record too. This was my great aunt, my grandmother's sister. And they said I'd have to get a court order, and I was not going to do that. I just, it seemed her story was so tangential to what I was trying to get out about the family trauma. I thought, I'm not dealing with this. And then her other sister, Denora, who spent 14 years at Kings Park State Hospital in New York. I had a death certificate that showed that she'd been a patient there. So I wrote to them and I said, do you have her records? And they said, we won't even tell you if she's a patient there. They were, and I got a form letter, by the way. It was like they were saying no 3 ways to Sunday, as the saying goes. They said that there's such a stigma about mental illness that they don't reveal who even is a patient, and that they would continue to not do that until after the patient dies. And then they also said, they just gave me a bunch of reasons, like, and I'm like, well, I know she was there. I've got this death certificate. They didn't care. Um, so it's a really, it depends on the state. It's hard for me to advise anybody unless they're looking for somebody in Connecticut, and I know how to do that. But yeah, the other states, you just never know. But I would always ask, and also talk to not only the state archives, but also to local historical societies. You might find somebody who knows something. And yes, other than that, unfortunately, the census is only done once every 10 years. So you might find your ancestor in a census, but what if they were there from like 1922 to 1927? You're kind of out of luck. So that's all I can tell you about now.
Okay. Someone says, how did you search for relatives with only first names? So like the woman and
Well,
her son.
I was using Ancestry.com, and you don't have to put the names in, the surnames in. You just leave it off the form. And I knew that that was like, Marie and Charles, just, but it turns out I also limited it by Marie's age. If you use, I'm more well versed in Ancestry.com, and I know that's not the only game in town, but the way they did it, I could like pin down the date. I could make it exact, and I did a few things like that. But the fact of the matter was, because it was actually another family member, the whole thing was kind of moot and comical when I saw it. I said, wait a minute, that's Philippe's brother. So I got kind of lucky. I hope that answered your question.
Well, it's an answer. I don't know if it's one that they'll necessarily like, but it does, like you mentioned, you can on ancestry.com, you don't have to put the surname in there. So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and a lot of times, correct me if I'm wrong, Ancestry uses other family trees to connect, correct?
Yeah.
That have been made public. So a lot of times that would help if you can kind of, using the magic of computers, create a connection there if it sees common ancestors.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that, like, even in the way I told it earlier, I had a chain of, how I was going to do it, and if if the whole census thing didn't work, I was going to have to get creative and, do newspapers or whatever. I was just very lucky that my first guess was right.
Okay. Next question I have here is, many poor families were in survival mode most of their lives, and I can see parallels of your family with both of my parents' families. Poverty, no birth control, hard, laborious jobs, and no mental health support created many broken and separated families. It is no wonder that families turn to state mental hospitals for relief. Have you researched other families with similar circumstances?
Not specific families, but I did do a lot of research in general about the history of the state hospitals. And what you say is true. One of I'd always heard that these state hospitals were horribly, horribly overcrowded. But the fact was that it wouldn't have been so bad, except for it turned out to be a dumping ground for other people who basically the hospitals couldn't help. They weren't curable. For example, before there were antibiotics, when a person got syphilis and they would get into the late stages of the disease, it's called psoriasis, but basically it causes dementia. And so these people had mental behavioral problems, but they were never going to get better. But they're like, what do we do with them? Well, let's just send them to the state hospital. And then also in the early 20th century, before there was like Medicare and Social Security, and you'd get senile elderly people, and the family might, and also as society got more urbanized and people weren't living on farms, they were like going out to work, and they couldn't leave a senile relative at home alone while they worked. And then again, the state hospital turned out to be a solution that they used. And so that's part of why the hospitals were just horribly overcrowded. And then, of course, there was the simple matter that they would take people in who were mentally ill, and they really didn't know how to cure mental illness. And so a lot of them never left, which is why I was amazed that after, almost a dozen years that my grandmother actually got out and she wasn't cured. So anyway, boy, I went off on a tangent there. I hope that was sort of on point. I
Okay,
I
next
think that,
question. Go
oh
ahead,
yeah,
sorry.
I think the question was about poverty and how state hospitals were a solution for it. So I think I nailed it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was essentially, I mean, the question was, have researched other families with similar
Oh yeah,
circumstances?
right. I couldn't do it. I mean, that's the big problem, and I think it's kind of a shame that these records are not open for historical researchers or medical or psychiatric researchers. If anybody gets it, it's going to be the family member. But what that means is, there's a lot of rich information in these records that could tell people there's things that could be learned if these records were accessible, but the laws are just like, it's like impossible. And I think it's unfortunate.
Okay, the next question I have here, would you know how to access records from state hospitals in Pennsylvania?
Well, like I said, I think you just have to go to the state archive in Pennsylvania or the state library in Pennsylvania and hope for the best. I didn't have to try Pennsylvania, so I don't know. But that would be my first step. And then also, if you know what town the hospital was in, then definitely tap into the local historical society because they may have some tips for you.
Okay, someone asks, was Griselia diagnosed at the asylum? Do you think postpartum psychosis could have been the mental illness? She had many children in a few years.
Yeah, her diagnosis was basic. I can't remember the exact terminology, but it's equivalent of what today is manic depressive disorder or something. I think they call it bipolar disorder now. But um, honestly, some of their diagnoses that I looked on my other relatives, it's like I think it was they were a stab in the dark. But in that era, I don't know that it mattered much because they did the same to all of them. It's like they restrained them. They were really big into hydrotherapy, where they would soak them in hot tubs. And unfortunately, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it in this talk. Unfortunately, Graziella was during the era where they believed that mental illness was caused by it's hidden infections in the body, which they felt were most likely to be located in the teeth. So they pulled out all her teeth, and they would pull out teeth of lots of mental patients, thinking that that would cure their mental illness. But they really, you know, I don't know. I felt like it was unfortunate for the mental patients. They were essentially, guinea pigs for wacko theories because nobody really knew how to cure mental illness at that time. And I know that even now, it's not a gimme that they can cure somebody's mental illness either, although they do help people.
Okay, someone says, in the census records, were all the patients and the employees all living on site?
Well, my understanding is that when they did the census at the institutions, they only did the resident employees and then they listed all the patients because they were all obviously um, patients there. And at least in like the 1920 census or most of the early 20th century censuses, patients were listed and called inmates. And I really, it's almost like they modeled the hospital system after the prison system. You may have heard me say that my grandmother was paroled because that's what they called it. So, but yeah, I don't think it like if an employee didn't live on site, I think that they were enumerated in their primary residence. But a lot of people live there because the attendants had to be there 24 hours a day. And back in like the 20s, it's like they had to work 12-hour shifts. And I was just really, I can't even imagine working under those circumstances.
Okay, corollary to that question, was it the practice for employees to live on site in mental institutions?
They were required to early on, and that was unfortunate. So one of the one of the things that caused some of the abuses was that they their pay was so low, and the working conditions were tough. They had to work 12-hour days. They had to live on site. They couldn't even leave the hospital without permission of the superintendent. And most people could find a better way to make a living. So um, I'm not saying that everybody who worked as an attendant in a state hospital was a bad person, but it was the kind of job that attracted people that were otherwise unemployable. And then they would show up, and the hospitals never had enough staff, so that a new person would show up and they'd say, here's the keys, keep an eye on things. And so it was just full of possibilities for abuse. But yeah, they were required to live there, and sometimes they lived in the same building where the mentally ill were. And so in the middle of the night, if somebody decided to start screaming and then another patient starts screaming, I mean, it was just like a very difficult way to make a living. But like I said, maybe these people just didn't have any other options.
Okay, that's most of the that's the questions. I just had a lot of comments about people who said they had never thought about researching at a mental hospital. So lots of thanks for that. A couple
Oh,
comments about the great presentation. Um,
thank you.
I'm not sure if you can answer this one. Someone says, would you know if the requirement was that staff lived on site at St. Elizabeth Hospital in DC?
No, I really don't know, but I'm sure there's a historical society that can answer that question.
I, I, I would imagine that the DC Historical Society would probably be the starting point for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I based my statement on I did do some research, like I said, generally about state hospitals. So I know it was prevalent. That was the way a lot of them were run. So who knows about St. Elizabeth's?
Okay, and then just the last thing I see here is someone asks, have you read Annie's Ghost by Steve Luxemburg? It is also about a family secret regarding a mental hospital. Highly recommended.
Yes, yes. And I'd like to mention that because when I first started uncovering this, and I think I got to write about this. This is really I got to tell people what's going on. But it just seemed like, wow, I'm exposing like all of the family secrets and terrible things, and it's and part of me said that doesn't feel right. So, but very early on in my genealogical journey, I started listening to the Genealogy Gems podcast. And right at that time, it just so happened she had Steve Luxembourg as a guest on her podcast, and he started talking about Annie's ghost. And I'm going, oh my gosh, it's a thing. People do this. And it was a real encouragement to me. Excuse me. So, yes, I read it. I do highly recommend it. And it was one of the early inspirations for my work, I would say.
Okay. With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up because it's after 8 o'clock, and that's about all the questions we've got. So,
Oh,
Julianne, any last comments before we close up for the evening?
only to say thank you, Matt. And thank you to Montgomery History for giving me a place to tell my story. And I'm really happy that so many people attended. And gosh, I wish I could see you all, but it's
Hopefully,
been
very soon.
yeah, and it's been really nice. And thank you very much. I had a good time telling you about
I
this.
One last question because I know that you would like to have this one asked. Will you write a book on your family?
Oh yeah, well, I have I actually have a manuscript already done. And I've made some attempts at getting it published, and so far no luck. And because of the pandemic, I put a hold on it because I just really find that trying to get something published is a real leap of faith, and you have to feel very confident. And the pandemic situation and other things going on in our world, it's, I'm just pretty much tapped out with the anxiety. So I think I'm going to put a pause on it. Also, as an aside, I'm very involved in research in the Aspen Hill Pet Cemetery. So for those two reasons, I do have a manuscript. I would like to get it published, but I'm not going to try to do that in the next 6 months to a year until things feel settled to me.
Okay. Well, if anybody knows a publisher, I'm sure
Yeah,
Julianne would love to hear from them.
I'd make an exception if someone knows a publisher. Anyway,
Okay.
thank you for asking.
All right. Well, lots of thank yous. So I definitely, everyone seems to have appreciated the presentation. I know I certainly did. I've heard it before, but it's always you learn something new every time. So I mean, hearing it again was a great refresher, and it's such an interesting story that you wouldn't necessarily have heard about. So again,
Yeah.
Julianne, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who stuck with us to the end here. We're so glad you joined us, and hope you have a great week next week, and tune in for the History Conversation Rewind. Julianne, have a great evening. Thanks
You
again.
too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.